Dr. Frances Cress Welsing has finally taken her place among the ancestors. The Queen Mother of African intellectualism inspired fully 3 generations of Africans both in the U.S. and abroad with a fuller understanding of the psychology of white supremacy, why it's at war with us and will not stop. Why no amount of negotiating with them, no amount of begging, pleading, or cultural assimilation with them will change this. Fear of genetic annihilation. In her seminal work, The ISIS Papers, Dr. Cress Welsing laid bare the racial hyperphobia that lies at the rotten heart of white supremacy, and why it is that most, if not all, people identifying themselves as white follow white supremacy, or at the very least are supportive of it. But this is not meant to be a eulogy for this titan of African knowledge. Her transition from living ancestor to ascended ancestor changes nothing. She did her part to push the annihilation of white supremacy, and her legacy falls to us to promote and defend. And that brings me to the posthumous attacks on Dr. Cress Welsing. Admittedly, she was not exactly a household name, but that was because a formal media blackout was placed on her almost 30 years ago after she went on the Phil Donahue show and introduced America to the Cress theory of color confrontation and racism white supremacy. She explained how everything from education to cartoons to even sports represented a racial dynamic in the minds of white people. She put a name on racism: white supremacy. Clearly, this woman wasn't talking about racism in the mealy-mouthed, middle-of-the-road terminology that white people have always demanded that we speak in, as if you can separate racism from power, or as if people reacting to the centuries-long oppression they've been subjected to somehow is equivalent to the system of white privilege and ultra-brutality that undergirds the dominant society. But Dr. Cress Welsing was different in one other regard. Although she was an academic and a woman of letters, she was not a bootlick to any white university or school. She got her degrees from them and absolutely nothing else. An African who uses the prestige of the academy to attack that very apparatus of white supremacy. Their worst nightmare. Dr. Cress Welsing did so much to open the eyes of her people, and even in death she continues to clarify things for us and to show us who the enemy within is, because all kinds of sellouts are now coming out of the woodwork. Even now, with her body not even buried, we see a phalanx of coons, media whores, sellouts, academic nobodies, and professional white ass-kissers attacking her. These names are too familiar. The first scumbag to stick his neck up that we'll deal with is Mark Lamont Hill, CNN and the Huff and Puff Post's perennial favorite black friend. He's a near-constant fixture on CNN, the very white smear machine who boldly defended the murder of Trayvon Martin and who did more than anyone to open the floodgates of rampant violence against Africans in America in the 21st century. But not once does Lamont Hill acknowledge this or the part that he's played in all this. We warned you all time and again that when you see these white supremacist media organs putting a particular black person on the air all the time, it's because they've been vetted 5 ways from Sunday. They are, as the Soviets used to say, politically reliable. Mark Lamont Hill's little better than a stage actor, and a poor one at that, pretending to intellectualize our oppression rather than put a name on it. He started off by giving what seemed to be a laudatory acknowledgement of Dr. Cress Welsing's passing. On its face, it seemed respectful enough. But then, only a few hours later, he proved that he didn't mean a single word he'd said, because he eagerly co-signed a vicious slandering of her by a longtime homosexual and wannabe scholar, Jeffrey McCoon. Well, at least his parents gave him the right name, because a coon is exactly what he is. McCoon's post was a vicious and slanderous barrage of lies and vitriol that didn't reflect Hill's earlier praise in any shape, form, or fashion, and that Hill heaps praise on a post so diametrically opposed to his own and goes so far as to say it was more thoughtful and nuanced than his own proves where this chump has always stood. No, Lamont, McCoon's feculent assault on Dr. Frances Cress Welsing was totally thoughtless, and there was no nuance at all, because a bald-faced pack of lies like this doesn't allow for nuance. Now, before we go into McCoon's ridiculous attention whoring, we need to give you some of this Coons background. McCoon is an associate professor of a women, gender, and sexuality studies program. Also, McCoon is a professor in the performing arts department. Guess that makes him a bad actor in more ways than one. McCoon teaches one of those courses that's not actually about anything. You want to know why so many black students leave these universities with no prospects? Because they got a bullcrap degree in a program that's worthless. McCoon is one of these black mouthpieces, given a token position because he's proven that he's willing to stand for gay empowerment and for black genocide, or as his kind like to call it, abortion. He thinks trying to identify himself as a homosexual as fiercely as he can will help him to transcend being black. No wonder Dr. Cress Welsing offended him so much. He started off by saying we shouldn't negate the damaging acts and rhetoric of the deceased. The only people Dr. Frances Cress Welsing ever damaged were white supremacists and their fellow travelers, like you, McCoon. She pointed out that black men who are feminized are also black men who will never fight. Well, you can guess what a black homosexual like McCoon thought of that. He characterized Dr. Cress Welsing's honoring of black manhood as demonizing and distorting black women and LGBT folks. He then goes on to criticize Cress Welsing's common-sense approach to male-female relations and African tradition right before he decides to assert that there is no European colonialist project of destruction. I suppose when you spend every day wishing you could snuggle up next to a white man, the last thing you want is someone to tell you it won't work. He then goes on to say that her work was lacking in humaneness and was not well researched. You know, Jason had a discussion not so long ago with a so-called professor of intercultural communication and rhetoric, yet another program that doesn't mean anything. She even had a doctorate, though you sure couldn't tell by listening. Not surprisingly, all she could do was regurgitate the exact same handful of talking points given to her by her white handlers. Jason asked her several times pig-simple questions about her own beliefs, and she couldn't answer a single one of them. This is what the dominant society promotes as a black intellectual. Next, he gives the worst of his lies. This piece of dirt actually had the nerve to compare this grandmaster teacher herself to genocidal rapists like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, calling her a tyrannous voice of black radical ridiculousness. I suppose that's as opposed to the tyrannous voice of radical gay ridiculousness that he represents. Let me tell you something, Coon. Thomas Jefferson enslaved the very children he'd had by Sally Hemings, black children, and they were not free until after he died. Same for George Washington's slaves. The best thing those animals ever did for the world was to leave it. And when they died, the long global nightmare they'd subjected the world to began to fade ever so much. Dr. Welsing's life, on the other hand, was what liberated us. Black people who didn't understand the life and death struggle they were in, or even why, were set loose from a prison of ignorance by that woman. Her death makes that light of freedom just a little more dim at a time when white supremacy is once again on the march. With her gone, we move just that much closer to extermination. How could any sane person actually compare her to that? In the end, he attempts to link himself to her own pristine legacy by claiming that he would want people to tell the good and bad about himself after his own passing. Well, McCoon, you won't have to wait until then to hear the truth about your dirty self. And there's nothing good to say, and no one will remember you for anything other than being a feckless house Negro who puts what he does in the bedroom above and beyond whether or not he even survives. It is precisely cowardly deviants like you that Dr. Cress Welsing was talking about. There is a European colonialist program of destruction which everyone can see, even white people. And you're too cowardly to fight it or even to speak against it. Taking a submissive posture before the enemy is what I would expect from an emasculated coward. Dr. Cress Welsing stood on the front line. You, on the other hand, are scurrying for a place to hide. Your very existence and the way you've chosen to live your so-called life proves her point. Wherever there is human suffering, there are human vultures. A worm like Coons spends his days and his nights on his knees for white men, bowing, scraping, and doing whatever else he has to make sure they're perfectly pleased with him. Make no mistake, the audience he and his cohorts are trying to reach with this little stunt isn't black people, and the target isn't Dr. Cress Welsing either. The target is you and me, and the audience is their white handlers. And if an otherwise wannabe academic nobody wasn't enough, we have a total nobody. And like his other two pals, he presses the same pathetic lie, and for the exact same reason. It is precisely this type of absurd hyper-exaggeration and idiotic overreach that has prompted so many to see the gay movement as being nothing other than a pack of radical anti-heterosexual bigots. It's plain to see you have an issue with being black and with Africans in general. It's also obvious that you have a lot of unresolved issues from your childhood and are too inept or morally cowardly to face them. To R.L. Stevens and Jeff the Coon, this is the reason why you got no black support in California when Proposition 8 was on the ballot. You've made your utter hatred of black heterosexuals crystal clear. If we follow your ideology, then within 50 years there will be no more black people in the United States. To us, that's a nightmare, though to you it would seem you think it's the best of all possible worlds. And your relentless insistence that whatever pathetic adjective you put after or before your ethnicity means something is a delusion for you and a danger to us should we be so silly as to keep you around. The society doesn't give a damn what you believe, what you do for a living, or in the bedroom. You're black, and that makes everything else irrelevant. Hide your head in the sand all you want. They aren't playing along with your escapist fantasy. He then goes on to say that this alleged anti-gay streak was in fact the only point Dr. Cress Welsing spent her life trying to make. You heard that right. He said Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's anti-gay ideology isn't a side dish, it's the main course stemming from her position. He then goes on to say that under her worldview, the most revolutionary thing he could possibly do is impregnate black women. Again, an empty-headed clod who clearly doesn't know anything about Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's work other than that she didn't endorse homosexuality, and to him that was enough. Also, she said a black man shouldn't marry, much less have children, until he passed the age of 35, so he'd be best established financially and ready to support a family. That's a far cry from the moronic caricature of her position that this clown was trying to assert. And yes, under a system of white domination that has made it a capital offense for a black child to walk the streets, it is indeed a revolutionary act for those being subjected to genocide to keep producing more black children. Though one has to wonder why a homosexual like this Stevens character even cares whether or not black women get pregnant. When we tell you that these clowns identify more with white supremacists than they do with black people, that's exactly what we meant. And if Dr. Cress Welsing's championing of black heterosexuality is too much for you to tolerate, then tough. She was our queen mother teacher, not yours. What she said was for our empowerment, not yours. Dr. Cress Welsing wasn't interested in helping anyone gain sexual access to non-black people, and clearly that's your entire reason for being. Sex is a lower brain function. It is a part of life, not the end-all and be-all. So when you elevate a bedroom activity to your single reason for existence, you're not merely ignorant, you're deranged. She understands white supremacy as a monster we must stay away from. You see it as a chance to pursue your sexual fixation. Well, you go and do that. Keep studying gender and sexuality and any other irrelevant trivia, but leave the scholarship to the scholars. Being a coon is a career that doesn't come with a retirement plan. Men far smarter than you assailed our African master teachers in the past, and all of them wound up being subjected to humiliation and punishment at the very hands of the same white society who they were so sure were their friends. Being a featured guest on a low-rated cable news channel or a high-rated website doesn't change the fact that you're not white. You don't come off as open-minded or intellectually nuanced when you attack people who speak on African people's behalf. To compare Dr. Cress Welsing to slaveholders and genocidal racists makes you come off as a mouthpiece and a tool. The white people who you think you're pleasing already didn't like her for the exact same reason that they don't like you. Because she's black. It gratifies me to see the vermin pitch a fit because this titan is receiving her just due from her people. I enjoy seeing that her words cut you to the bone. You've spent years, if not decades, sitting on your hatred of her, and now that she's joined the ancestors, you think it's safe to tear her down. You're wrong on both counts, because a titan like Dr. Frances Cress Welsing would never be harmed by a pack of mental midgets like yourselves. Even her white critics like William Shockley didn't dare attack her in the manner that you do, and these people were dyed-in-the-wool racists. That's how far beneath contempt you've fallen. In intelligent black society, we have a policy where our ancestors are concerned. Speak against one of them, and you've spoken against all of us. We do not forgive or forget such slights. It took Stephen A. Smith almost 20 years to be excommunicated. Mark Lamont Hill, Jeff the Coon, R.L. Stevens, and the rest of the sellouts did it in a single instant. We'll be calling out more such scum as the days pass. Already we've put such pressure on them that they don't dare speak on their own social media pages. And realize that every one of you who are named as attacking our beloved ancestor has committed an unpardonable sin. The future doesn't belong to gender-fluid swirler intersectionalists. It belongs to the Africans who are uncompromising.